Namaste, everyone. Welcome to our new episode of Channel See You Soon, which we have started among this second wave of pandemic across the world and especially in India. And this is a humble motive from our end to interview guests from not just the country, but from the world over. And in today's initiative, I have a very old friend of mine joining us from Canada, and he's a civil servant there. He is a part of the government and the bureaucracy. And I've had the good fortune to study with Mr. Jordan Z back in 2007-8 in my program of NYU at NUS, as it is popularly called. So Jordan, welcome and namaste from India.
Thank you. Namaste to you as well and to all the listeners. It's so good to be joining you and seeing you.
Just to, before we start a Q&A session, I must introduce and give a brief introduction about Jordan. Jordan is a lawyer by training and is currently a member of the Ontario Bar. He is also currently the Director General who is responsible for international affairs, international trade, and intergovernmental affairs in the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development in the Government of Canada. And prior to this, Jordan has served as Director of Open Government at the Treasury Board of the Secretariat in the Government of Canada, and has led Canada's successful campaign for a seat on the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership. From 2015 to 16, he has served as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Minister at Environment and Climate Change of Canada during Canada's signing and ratification of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. This is just a brief introduction. And with our question and answer series, we are going to discover a lot more. I know Jordan is pressed for time, and we have just under 50 minutes to encapsulate his powerful and inspirational life journey. So Jordan, before I start formal Q&A series, I always inquire from my guests to please tell our viewers, and most of our viewers are young listeners, young law students, budding lawyers. Some of them are also harbor the dream of going to Canada someday and practicing there. So please tell us about your early education, about your birth, and what was that point in time in your life which inspired you to pursue law as a career and become a lawyer?
Thanks for the question. And just first to start, by saying how wonderful it is to be connecting different parts of the world. I think it's excellent what you're doing, and being able to draw the experiences of different people from different parts of the world together and sharing experiences like this. I think it's a great opportunity. My own experience has been quite varied. And you might remember too, when we first met, my background is actually in music, in composition, in piano performance. And I studied at the University of Toronto and also at Berkeley in Boston. So a very kind of unusual way at coming to the law in many ways. But I do think that the opportunity that provided me. And I also think that, it's really important to be able to draw on different interests to create a sense of balance in your life more generally. And even now I find myself sitting at the piano writing and drawing on that experience, even though now, I've gone through law school and we did our master's together, our LLM. And, I've worked both in a private law firm context and in a government context as a lawyer, providing advice on a whole variety of issues for the government of Canada over the years. But to answer your question, I think what really sparked in me, I grew up in a family of lawyers. My dad is a lawyer and my sister as well. My sister, in fact, said at 7 years old that she wanted to be a lawyer, which I envied her ability to focus with such precision on what she wanted to do at such an early age. I was not in that category at all. I was interested in many different things. So I think for me, it took a lot more time to figure out where I wanted to be and how I wanted to express my interests in law. But I think I did spend a time, and this is before we met in the master's program, a year in South Africa doing constitutional litigation with a public interest law firm there. And that really changed my perspective about what the law can achieve, about the fundamental importance of bringing fairness and justice beyond just the written rule of law, but really in looking at the law as a tool really of equity. I had the chance to work with Nelson Mandela's lawyer, George Bezo, who represented Mandela, in many of his trials, and saw the kind of passion and dedication to the law that he had. And so I redirected some of my interests from a private sector context which was great. Don't get me wrong, it was excellent experience. I really enjoyed it. Understanding how to serve clients in a high stress context, I think really served me well. And I was working in Toronto for a period of time. But I also think that being able to have experience in a public sector context and understanding the value and the power of how the law can shape and contribute to decision making in the public service and government is a wonderful thing. And that's what I've grown to learn over the years. And so after our master's, I did start working in our Department of Foreign Affairs in the Government of Canada in the Legal Bureau, and I had a chance to advise on some really interesting files, including environmental files, which I know is important to all of us.
Very interesting journey, Jordan, because I personally know that you have a huge inclination towards music, and as you rightly said, Berkeley is one of the top universities to study music in. In fact, I keep listening to some nice Hindi recitation from University of Berkeley of some Bollywood songs. Just there's a follow-up question. You mentioned about Mr. Bezos. I don't know, out of curiosity, is it related to Mr. Jeff Bezos of Amazon?
No, not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. His story is fascinating because he came as a Greek refugee to South Africa. Mm-hmm. And his father did, and he at a very young age moved to South Africa and found himself kind of in the limelight in representing Mandela as a young lawyer, and told me many of the stories and what it was like being there under apartheid and using the law to try to achieve fairness and shed light on what was going on. But no relation to Bezos.
Right.
the other Bezos.
Right. So my follow-up question is that you again went to one of the top universities in Canada to study law, Osgood Law School. So please tell us about your time in law school. What were the type of internships that you undertook during your tenure as a law student? How important to your mind is pursuing an internship? Just for a career building prospect.
Yeah. So I would say two things. I really enjoyed my time in law school, in part because there were so many opportunities to get a sense of what it was like to practice law early. So the first thing was there's a clinical program at Osgood Hall Law School in Toronto, and I was involved in the immigration portion of that clinic, which basically meant that on a daily basis, you were talking to clients or potential clients about their refugee claims, and immigration questions that they had, and navigating, what is invariably a very complicated system, and, humanitarian and compassionate applications, pre-removal risk assessments, understanding and navigating that space. So for me in law school, it was really important where there are opportunities to expose yourself either via a law firm or a clinic to the practice of law early. I think those are opportunities really worth seizing, because they can give you a sense of what the day-to-day is like. As you know, in law school, I mean, so much can be very theoretical and can be fairly esoteric, and you're studying cases, you're looking at interpretations, but I think it's very useful to gain some exposure into what daily practice might look like, interactions with clients wherever possible. The other, second piece that I would respond to is in relation to experiences abroad. If you do have an interest in international or even any different kinds of domestic law, understanding, different contexts in a practical setting can be extremely useful. So in the Canadian context, for example, we're required after your law degree to proceed to an articling program for a year. And I had been a summer student at a law firm, and then I returned for a whole year to do my articles. And then when you are actually called to the bar and you've written the exam, you do have that exposure to what the day-to-day experience is like, what the needs of clients can be in different contexts, and I think that can be extremely valuable. In my case, the experience in South Africa was that internship. It was essentially an internship with George Bezos as well, really provided and inspired me to think of law not just as an academic exercise, but as a real tool for achieving greater fairness and equity in our communities and our society. And I think really imbued me with the sense of the responsibility that we have as lawyers beyond ourselves, really, and to our communities.
Hey, thank you for answering that so beautifully, Jordan. My follow-up question is, once you did your JD or LB, as we call it here in this part of the world, we met to study together in NYU at NUS. So please tell me, how was your experience of the program from your point of view? And many times, younger students who are wanting to go abroad, study for masters, ask me this question, whether a master's is going to land them with a job. And my answer to them is, look at it from an academic point of view, don't look at it from a job point of view, but that is my answer. I would like to know your response to this question, whether one should do masters only from an academic point of view, or does it also help students and international students especially to get a foothold or their foot in the door to some foreign country and then get a job subsequently?
Yes, excellent question. And I would say increasingly the level of education that people have in applying to in different contexts is higher than ever. So the competition is very stiff. I do think that in some cases, having an additional degree in LLM can be beneficial and can help to differentiate you from those who don't have a master's. It's not always required. So I think the answer really depends on the context within which you're seeking to work. So for example, I know a lot of people in law firms in Canada, and because you're required to have an undergraduate degree and then a law degree, they already have 2 degrees in a Canadian context, and then you're doing the articles and then you're getting admitted to the bar. So in very many cases, colleagues do not have a master's degree. But in the government, I would say in public interest or in a civil society context, I would almost say it's a requirement. All of the job posters that I'm seeing in those contexts are if not saying a requirement, certainly that having an LLM is an asset. And so, you're looking at organizations like, the human rights organizations and potentially, legal opportunities at those, they're all kind of suggesting at the master's level. And certainly my very first job, which was in the legal bureau at Foreign Affairs in Canada, I think all of my colleagues, with maybe a couple of exceptions, have received their LLM. So not necessarily as much of a requirement in the private sector, but I think increasingly in civil society and the public sector, it's really viewed as a strong and important asset. The other thing I would say, and I know I'm probably going on too long here, but is don't be afraid to take time in between your law degree and your LLM to really think about how you want to focus on your master's so that it really is reflective of your interest going forward and how you want to maybe frame and develop your career going forward. In my case, I did spend some time, a couple of years in between, and I think it really helped me determine how I wanted to focus in my master's. Again, not required at all, and I know many people who go directly from their law degree to their master's, but in my case, it really helped me understand where and how I wanted to focus my efforts. And my experience in South Africa in that case informed how I wanted to really focus on international issues in the context of my LLM.
Right. I think that's a very, very good answer, Jordan. I think now the next question which springs out, out of my mind is, you have been a practicing lawyer and then you entered the bureaucracy, which you have been serving excellently for the past decade, more than a decade now, I think 12, 13 odd years that you've been a part of the governance in the Canadian system. How has been the transition for you from being a lawyer and then to being a bureaucrat? What has been the fundamental difference? Has there been a thought process change or overall in the thinking process, how lawyers think and how bureaucrats think?
So it's an excellent question. And but I'm not a stranger to change. I went from music to law and practicing there, and from that context to working in a government context. So I think in many ways we have to be flexible and responsive to the environments in which we find ourselves, and hopefully draw on on our skills and our background, and recognize the connections between different fields. So I have learned to do that by virtue of my own experience. But I would say the main difference between private sector and public sector that I've observed is the pace of change. Everything in government requires, not everything, but I would say the vast majority of important decisions require significant consultation. So you find yourselves in some cases on very large teams, very diverse teams, and part of your role is articulating clearly what the advice is to that broader community. We often call it in Canada the federal family, which can implicate multiple departments on a particular issue. And I'll give you one example. I'm currently working in the context of artificial intelligence in facilitating international collaboration in that space. And so, the first step very often is making sure that the various interests within my own organization are brought to bear and brought together and coordinated in a thoughtful way. So that could mean including the industry sector colleagues, but also research colleagues and strategic policy colleagues and legal considerations, and putting those all together to essentially try to formulate a thoughtful Canadian position on a particular issue, let's say. And then you go beyond that organization to other departments. For example, working with our colleagues in global affairs, the colleagues responsible for digital technology in a government context, and you realize that that all of those different points of view need to be integrated and thought through and brought to bear in order to land on advice that we give to our ministers and to our governments. So I would say the pace is much different, and so very often needing to be more patient and consultative, I think, in the course of the work is very important. But I would say this, and this is the last thing I'll say: when there is a decision taken, the impact can be very significant. Once you've consulted, once you've achieved that level of buy-in, and a decision is taken either by the minister or the prime minister or the government more broadly, the impact on people's lives can be very significant. Like, for example, navigating privacy in the face of a digital economy. What does that actually mean? And what should we be thinking of in terms of protecting privacy and security of citizens as we increasingly go online and we're living in a digital environment? So that's just my experience in government.
I think you raised very pertinent and good points, because you are working in this field of AI, which is also catching up with greater force even in India. So in fact, I have a follow-up question for you. Because AI and all the data collation these days and policy making is of great priority, I think, by almost every government in the world. So my question to you is, how does one ensure data-driven policy making and not a policy-driven data making? So because that the idea is to get data and then make a policy. But however, it's increasingly seen that people are using for their vested interest, perhaps, making policy and then getting data based on that. So what's your take on that?
No, that's an excellent question. And the terminology that we often use here is evidence-based decision making. So it's a bit of a catchphrase within our government is, whatever we're doing, it's based on the data, it's based on the empirical evidence. And then, of course, there are considerations that are layered on top of that go beyond the role of the public service. For example, in the public service, within the legal community, but also more broadly, the policy community, when you're coming together and providing advice on a specific topic, I think the number one thing that we do in providing the advice, be it from a legal perspective or more broadly in a policy environment, is to try to base our advice on the evidence, on the data, making sure that there are analytics to support the assertions in the advice that we're advancing. Extremely important for the credibility of the institutions that serve a government, for example, that they're focused on those objective criteria and that level of rigor and analysis underpins the advice that we provide. But the reality is, on top of that, at the political level, there will always be a political calculation about how to navigate that advice, perhaps how to sequence a particular set of actions that a government might take, or how to balance the advice that you're giving in one context against the advice in another. And I think one of the key things that I've learned that has really helped me think through a lot of the problems, both with in the private sector, but certainly in the public sector as well, is, and I think a legal education can really help with this, is balancing competing interests. Understanding that, in very many cases, many of these issues wouldn't come before us unless there were a set of competing interests that needed to be balanced and weighed. And that is never more important or clearer than in the context of a government that has limited resources and is seeking to make choices about what to prioritize. And so the more that lawyers or policymakers can base their advice on the data or objective criteria that can be really thoroughly analyzed, the more it will stand up to scrutiny and hopefully be credibly integrated into the decision-making at the political level.
Thank you for that frank answer, Jordan. My follow-up question is, do you see a paradigm shift? Not so much, you'll have to speak about the bureaucracy, but so far as the legal industry is concerned, because traditionally, lawyers, especially the old school ones, are always reluctant to adapt to technology and embrace technology. However, I think what we have all seen the world over with the COVID wave is courts have become digital, virtual court hearing are a more accepted norm. So do you think going forward and the use of AI, is the judiciary going to take it in a good stead, or are there going to be challenges in the legal sector so far as AI is concerned?
So this is an excellent question. I have a very good friend actually who works at the World Bank, who just put together a course at McGill University on AI for law students specifically. And he's navigating this space very carefully for lawyers. I think it's extremely important to be thinking about law in a digital environment now. I have two young nieces, they're 4 years old, twin nieces. And, I often think, what would I like them to do? Or not that I'll have much of a say in it necessarily, but that understanding this digital environment and how data is used is going to be extremely important. And so whatever elements, that I can encourage in their education, I think will be really important. In a legal context, I think the most important issues arising are the protection of individual privacy and the security of that data, reassuring ourselves that as we're exploring these incredible new innovations in AI and quantum and many other fields as well, that we're doing it in a way that can maintain and build public trust. Because the whole thing collapses if people don't trust and believe that their inputs or their contribution or their participation is potentially at risk. And we've seen a lot of examples of how, data can be compromised or, privacy not adhered to as much as perhaps they had thought, because they hadn't read through the terms and conditions, in great detail. And let's be honest, very few people do read the details of those terms and conditions. And so from a legal perspective, you might say, if you're advising the company, to include all of those, be very transparent about how the data will be used. But in practice, I think a lot of people find themselves, using platforms without full awareness of how their data might be being used. And so I think that's a really important part of the equation, is increasing public awareness of how, our data is being used, and how to use these technologies, including AI, in a responsible, ethical way, grounded in our shared values, like, our respect for human rights. I do think that's extremely important.
Again, I would say, very, very erudite answer. I have a follow-up question, not just strictly on AI, But going back to our days of NYU at NUS, it was a very unique program where I think two biggest universities in the world collaborated to invent very unique masters. And we, I think, were a batch of about 45 people from 30 or different nationalities. Now, the way that the world is changing and faster than ever in terms of digitization and how technology has evolved over the number of years, do you think the international barrier, and I speak from a very legal point of view, would this permit lawyers from across the borders, the world, to handle matters of human rights or even other important legal matters, be it AI, be it data or cyber frauds or data security, to be argued internationally without too much of impediment or an opposite force from other countries? Because if I today sitting in India can speak to you over a webinar, would that be a possibility tomorrow for, let's say, a lawyer in Kenya arguing in Australia, or an Australian lawyer arguing in India? Do you think that's a possibility we see at least in 10-15 years time, if not, let's say, the next 5 years?
I absolutely think that we're going to be, within the legal community, more involved in disputes that relate to digital technology, the use of data, and that lawyers will play an extremely important role in all of that. My only hesitation in responding to your question is that still there are so many distinctions across national boundaries about how data is used. The privacy regimes are very different in many cases. And even culturally, the conception of what should be adhered to in one country versus another might be very different. There might be a sense that individual data protection is valued in one society much more significantly than in another. So I do think that there will be important emphasis placed on understanding these regimes in our respective national jurisdictions, but also the connection or interoperability between these regimes as well. So like, for example, in G7 and G20 context, I know there's a digital economy task force in the G20 context, and India participates, all of the other G20 members participate. There's a lot of discussion about interoperability of our respective regimes. So how do we ensure that we can facilitate innovation and the free flow of data across boundaries, but doing it in a way that maintains trust? And so that's, in many ways, I think this is one of the challenges of our generation, is to say, how do we navigate this digital space and leverage the tools at our disposal, including the law, to ensure that decisions are reached and disputes settled in a way that reflects the balance that we're seeking and the interests of respect for human rights, respect for people's privacy and security. But this is not easy at all. Along with climate change, I really feel that navigating responsibly this digital economy is probably one of the most important challenges of our time.
Very rightly said. I think political will, along with, I think, bureaucratic will, if I may say so, is required. Yeah. And I think, bureaucrats across the world, not just in Canada, but I think the world over, India and other countries, if the will is shown and in the service of humanity, I think a lot can be achieved. My next question to you, Jordan, is that you have been involved with the Open Government Initiative from the Government of Canada. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on this initiative and its governance philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So in my previous role, I was director of the Open Government Directorate in the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. Essentially, what that whole program is seeking to achieve, and I should mention the Open Government Partnership, which is an international platform to facilitate some of these ideas, speaks fundamentally about the importance of accountable government. So how do governments and how can they work with the public in a more responsible way, in a transparent way? It's really, a lot of it is about transparency in government, and it's about creating ongoing dialogue with the public that governments serve about the key decisions and priorities that they're taking. So to give you a specific example, each member of this Open Government Partnership makes their own commitments. So it's they advance their own commitments about what they're going to do. and they bring that to light and share it with the international community and say, okay, in the spirit of increased accountability and transparency, these are the commitments that we will undertake. And then they report on them and share them with the world. And there's an independent review that's conducted as well to see if the commitments that you yourself as a country if you're adhering to those commitments. So I think really it's about promoting a space for more dynamic engagement with the public so that they really feel that they're increasingly part of decision making, or maybe not decision making per se, but part of the process of input and consultation that ultimately leads governments to make decisions. So it was a very gratifying experience, but difficult because, of course, we know that there are increasingly global trends away from transparency, and greater trends of protectionism in many contexts. But I think overall the sense that in areas where it makes sense to shed more light on what's being done can be very helpful and can be in the public interest and can ultimately also be in the interest of the institutions that support and surround government.
Thank you for that answer and shedding the light on that crucial aspect. My next question for you is, for a transparent government to run smoothly, citizen participation in governance is essential. And in what ways, if you can answer this, has the Canadian public policy imbibed that? And any innovative or inventive ways in which the Canadian government has involved civil society in policy making or governance?
Excellent question. And I think about this every single day in my job. And now during COVID, as we're all kind of increasingly at home and we're trying to navigate, how do you actually reach out to stakeholders in a meaningful way in a context where we're all sitting at home? Well, that has really necessitated rethinking, virtual engagement with stakeholders in small and large groups, and providing more opportunities to hear from on an ongoing basis those communities and those stakeholders. So, I mean, as a general statement, I would say, as we know in democracies work best when the conversation is ongoing and dynamic and not just reflective of a once in an election period conversation. It's not simply about, electing our leaders and then going away and going back to our own worlds. It's about finding ways to remain engaged throughout that period, throughout that term, so that the ideas of our communities and potentially, that the clients that we're supporting or serving, or the advocacy that we're conducting in civil society, whatever the context may be, that those conversations are ongoing, that discourse is robust over the period of that term in office, let's say, of the government that we've elected. But I would say it's more challenging during COVID to reach out to those communities. We need to think about how to become more innovative about it. I would say that different group sizes for us has been extremely important. So talking to key leaders, but also talking to different associations, and also finding ways to help prepare people who are participating in those consultations to participate meaningfully. So providing material, providing some foundational information that can facilitate their, let's say, more profound and meaningful participation than would otherwise be the case.
I think that's an excellent suggestion going forward, and how we are evolving, and how as society we have to keep everybody or all the stakeholders together, not, as you rightly said, at the time of elections, but even generally. My just few last question before we conclude the session is that you have served as the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Canada during the signing and the ratification of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Could you please tell us a little about what you think is the best way forward in harmonizing views on climate change, and what your analysis of the summit was?
Absolutely. So let me just say a couple of things just from a career standpoint. If there are individuals in the audience looking to figure out how to build and navigate their career, one of the best, I think, decisions I made in my own career was working with people like the Deputy Minister at Environment and Climate Change Canada, who you really look up to, who are smart, are extremely dedicated, but also people of integrity. And I think for me, understanding and seeing how somebody at that level works on a day-to-day basis was extremely enriching. So seeking out those opportunities to let's say get a window into the thinking and decision-making process of people who are at a more senior level, I think can be extremely gratifying. So I found just the experience of being in the room and being with somebody who's thinking through very difficult issues. I mean, let's face it, climate change involves questions about the economy, about how we organize ourselves to respond, about critical transitions within our economy, questions obviously about impact on the environment, mitigating the context, but also adaptation, adapting and realizing that where there are consequences, we need to empower and support our communities to adapt. So it brings into the equation so many different facets or so many different disciplines. So, like, as I mentioned earlier, I think the twin challenges of our generation are really to tackle climate change and navigate the digital economy as responsibly as possible. I'm very optimistic that, that we will be able to increase our level of ambition and address together the challenge of climate change. I know that later this year, the UK is hosting the next Conference of Party on climate change. And these are critical decisions that wherever we are in the world, whether we're in India or Canada or anywhere in between, that we work together to really try to come up with the solutions to these absolutely important questions. And I think in many cases, the legal background that many of your listeners or viewers have will put them in good stead in being able to understand the issues, spot issues, advocate for different points of view, and ultimately be able to analyze and hopefully bring us forward collectively closer to being able to address that very important challenge.
Thank you for those wonderful insights, Jordan. I know we are short on time and you have another important meeting to attend. But just before we end this program, as a matter of custom, we always ask our guests to please have some closing comments for our young guests. And when I say young, I just don't mean youth. I mean people who are young at heart and young in mind. So what's your message for them, number one? And also, while you're giving us your closing comment, the role of mentorship and how mentorship is important in any professional aspect.
Absolutely. And again, just a huge thanks to you for inviting me on this platform. I'm so happy to be here and share whatever insights that I can. We all come from different backgrounds, and humbly say that I certainly don't have any or even many of the answers, but I can share my own experience. And in that context, I would say, it's really important to nurture your interests in different areas. Had I said to myself, I wanted, I would just stay in one field of law, I might not have been able to explore the possibility of contributing in the public sector in the way that I have. So I think you have to, at various points, check in with yourself about where you're going and where your interests lie, and how you can make potentially some adjustments to better reflect where you want to go. And I think one of the key things that has helped me in that context has really been to seek to surround myself with people whom I respect and whom I look up to. And that kind of goes to your second point about mentorship. I've been very fortunate, even before I worked as a lawyer, in the context of the time I spent with George Bezos in the Legal Resources Center in South Africa, to the work of our climate agenda with the Deputy Minister at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Even though that wasn't a formal mentorship, it really was about exposing myself and seeking out opportunities to learn and to grow. And I guess the last thing I would say is really, and this may sound a little cliched, consider stretching yourself beyond what you think you're capable of doing. Take on new tasks where you think you have an interest. You might not be fully comfortable with them at first, but over time and with experience, you'll generate that comfort. And I think you can discover within yourself extraordinary ability by leaning into that discomfort and being willing to stretch yourself beyond the normal bounds of what you do. So I wish everyone out there the very best of luck in their careers, be it young at heart or young. You know, there's a lot of opportunity to demonstrate the value of how law can really bring people in our communities a greater sense of fairness and equity, and how we can leverage the tools and the skills that we've learned in school to address some of the biggest challenges of our generation, including climate change and, as we've talked about, the digital economy. So I, again, really, really am thankful to be here, and to you, Jayant, for your leadership. I think you've done extraordinary work in India, and I love the fact that you're so open about the lessons that you're learning and willing to share them. I think that's exactly the right thing to do. So would encourage others to do the same.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for taking your time out and giving these valuable nuggets of wisdom to our listeners. I think what you have said wonderfully is sometimes, you know, you have to be open to both ideas and challenges. And, you know, as the famous saying goes, what you seek is seeking you. So you have to, you know, be really, really open to the universe. And I'm a great believer in destiny. Having said that, I wish you all the luck going forward, and I wish you good health everybody around the world, not just in Canada and India. And I hope, sincerely hope and pray to God that, you know, this Corona is behind us. We find a solution to this problem sooner than later, and we can meet each other in person, you know, in the coming years, you know, much sooner, than we hope. And with this wonderful note, I'm also appealing to my listeners and viewers here. If you like our channel, please, you know, forward it, like it, subscribe it, share it to other people, so that the good that we've started with this small initiative can reach to as many people as possible. With this note, see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.